Okay, so it's been a week for you, but it's been a lot more than a week for me, for several reasons. First, it took me very long to actually get through the second half of this book, for reasons we'll get into. And secondly, I took like almost a full week after I finished reading it to let my thoughts sort of percolate before recording this. I've already read almost enough of Words of Radiance to record my first Words of Radiance video at this point, so I'll probably do that tomorrow. So the reason I took that break is because I didn't like this book very much. And when that happens, I like to take some time to let my thoughts gather and make sure that I actually don't like the book and not that I'm just like that something was that I misinterpreted something or that I didn't get what the book was going for. I sort of spent some time thinking about the book. It's what I did with Warbreaker, and it's what I did with this book. And I'm gonna be honest, I haven't found anything to change my mind. So this is going to be something of a negative review, but very different than my negative review of Warbreaker. I have very, very different problems with this one. So let's start from the top. I think this book is fine. I didn't hate it. I didn't dislike the experience of reading it. But it felt like reading a Marvel movie. And what I mean by that is, Marvel movies are fun to watch, they're entertaining, I've seen all of them, I like them, and once I've seen one, I generally no longer think about it. They're not they're fun, they're extremely entertaining, and they are not very deep or thought-provoking. They don't do a lot of theme stuff. And that's fine and fun sometimes, but it's not necessarily what I'm looking for in a book. And it's especially not what I'm used to expecting from Sanderson so far. So this book kind of took me by surprise because of how much like a Marvel movie it felt. To be more specific, what I mean by this is, the book has an extremely predictable and cliched plot structure. I could tell as soon as the scene happened where Marasi revealed her powers, and then she was like, "Oh, but I'm insecure about my powers because I think they're useless. Like, this is a useless power." The instant that happened, I was like, "Oh, she's gonna use the power in a pivotal moment, and that's how they're gonna beat the bad guy." Obviously. The moment I realized that Wax's whole thing was that he's scared that he'll repeat what happened with his wife and when he shot her, I was like, oh, at a critical moment, Wax is going to have to get over this and actually shoot a guy who's holding a woman, probably Marasi, maybe Steris, and he's going to succeed, and it's going to be him overcoming his trauma. It's just not very good, in my opinion. Now, I've talked in my Way of Kings videos about how sometimes predictability is great, because sometimes when a story is predictable, it's predictable because everything has been so perfectly set up within the story that you can see the shape of what's going to happen if you're paying attention because of how much setup there has been. That wasn't what this is. This is predictable because it's cliche, because I've seen it in a million other stories before. Miles himself as a villain, interesting tactical conundrum, his effective immortality. An interesting issue to overcome, an interesting problem to work around. However, it's underutilized because I don't feel like the way they ultimately take him down is is like a clever abuse of his power, which is what I was expecting. I was expecting him to do something like, I don't know, pin him to a wall by piercing him through the chest with like a spear or something, and he can't heal because the spear is still there, and so he dies. Or something like that. Or find a way to remove his metal mines. Or, I don't know, something other than get a bunch of guys who can just beat him up and tie him up. It just felt so anticlimactic. Like, oh, he lost because he just got severely outnumbered. And couldn't fight his way out. Okay. And then they just like execute him. It's, I don't know. It felt weird. Wax's character arc, if it can be called that, didn't feel particularly earned or well developed because I didn't feel like Wax was a character who had any real issues to overcome. Like, he's afraid to shoot. He's very specifically afraid to shoot people who are currently holding hostages. That's a good fear to have. You shouldn't do that most times. That's not a character flaw. That's being reasonable. So he did, like, his character feels static because aside from that one weirdly specific issue he had that I don't think he should have overcome, frankly, but he did. Aside from that one weirdly specific issue, he's fine, and he's the same guy at the end of the book that he was at the beginning of the book, basically. Marasi has the most of a character arc, I guess. But she doesn't get enough screen time for that to really be relevant. So I'm not gonna talk about Marasi that much because, like I said, she gets minimal screen time kind of and doesn't really get a lot of development. She does get an arc, but not like only by this book's standards, which are fairly low. Wayne doesn't have an arc at all, but I like that because Wayne doesn't need an arc. Wayne is perfect exactly as he is. Wayne is the perfect character. I love Wayne. Can we get rid of Wax and Marasi and just have this series be about Wayne instead? Because he's great. No notes on Wayne. He's just fantastic. Actually, weird segue from my negative criticism of this book. One thing I appreciate about this book is that in retrospect, keeping in mind when this book was written, I suddenly understand something that happened with Brandon Sanderson's Wheel of Time books. So, Brandon Sanderson finished the Wheel of Time after Robert Jordan's death. He wrote the final 3 books. And one thing that most people agree on is that in the first book that Sanderson writes, the character of Matt Cawthon, who is one of the main characters in the Wheel of Time, is weird. Like, he's just off somehow. He's not quite in character. Like, nothing super egregious, he just feels off, and he has a certain character quirks and ways of speaking and cadence and ways of thinking that don't feel like Matt in the previous 11 books. And Brandon Sanderson acknowledged this. He also said, oh yeah, I kind of messed up this here. And he fixed it. In the remaining 2 books, Matt, who is actually a very, very, very central figure, specifically in those remaining 2 books, is mostly back to being the character he always was. And I've always wondered what happened there, and now I know, because what happened there is that on paper, Matt Cawthon and Wayne are pretty similar characters. They are sort of these wily tricksters who are kind of womanizing, but also don't have a lot of luck with women, but they take it all in their stride. Like they're sort of the long-suffering sidekick character who also is like extremely competent, but only sometimes. Like there's a lot in common between these two characters. They fill similar archetypes, but they also have some important differences. And I think that Sanderson was writing this book, Alloy of Law, and the first Wheel of Time book around the same time, and he couldn't quite work out how to write these two very similar characters at the same time, so he just didn't, and so he just wrote Matt as Wayne. Which almost works, because like I said, they're really similar. But the thing that specifically tipped me off is that the one really weird character trait that Matt just suddenly gets in that book when Sanderson takes over is that he really, really likes playing characters and is always looking for opportunities where he can get in disguise and play a certain character. And he really likes developing overly unnecessarily elaborate backstories for those characters that he's playing. And this is played off as a joke a lot. And this is a fine character trait, but it's one that Matt never had before in any of the previous books. And it's like Wayne's primary character trait. So yeah, I think that's like, I think my theory is pretty solid here. I don't think there's much chance that this isn't what happened. Anyway, back to Alloy of Law. That was a unnecessarily long tangent about Wheel of Time, which should tell you a bit about how uninspiring I find this book, unfortunately. But I do have other issues with this book, actually. Believe it or not, there's more. So Miles, like I said, he has an interesting concept as far as powers go. Like he's sort of like you've got sort of half of the Lord Ruler problem. He's not all powerful, but he is unkillable, and you have to deal with that. But he doesn't really work as a villain otherwise. Like, all he has is this cool power. As a character, he's very one note. Well, that's not true. He has many notes. They're just very confusing notes. Miles's motivations in this book feel all over the place. Sometimes he talks about how he wants to improve the world, how he's seen the corruption in the city and he wants to change things, to make the world a better place. Hooray. Other times, he's like, I just grew sick and tired of catching criminals and seeing them like have better lives than we do, so I decided to become one because it's my turn to profit and have power and money. And then at one point he even implies that it's just because like he spent so long catching criminals that he's become better at crime than all of them, and so he knows he could do it better, and so he just feels the need to do it because he feels like he could. And individually, none of these are amazingly interesting motivations, but they would work. But the problem is that the book feels like it can't make up its mind on which one it is. And the one they bring up the most often is the one about changing the world. And, oh, the world is unfair, the roughs are being exploited by the city elites, and that's not fair, like rural-urban divide, rich-poor, makes sense. Social commentary, yay. Except, villains like that only work if they kind of have a point. Like, sure, their methods may be wrong, and they need to be stopped, but they have a point? And the book seems to really, really want us to believe that Miles doesn't have a point. Or at least Wax seems to believe that, even at the end of the book. Because Miles tells Wax, like, oh, how many people die in the streets every day because of unjust laws and economic realities of essentially capitalism. And yes, that's true. That is a significantly higher body count than murders, and it is also a body count that could be significantly reduced if those in power gave up some of their wealth and changed society for the better. However, Wax responds to this with no. Everything is fine, actually. The people in power are doing the best they can, and sometimes bad things just happen. Deal with it. And Wax gets the last word there, and then Miles loses, and the implication is that Wax is right. The implication is that what we are supposed to take away from that interaction is, oh, Wax sure told him. But like, what? What are you talking about? Miles was right. Again, his solution makes no sense, in large part because it's never really explained how he thought what he was doing was going to change anything. Like, he was just like, the world is unfair. I'll rob trains about it and also help this rich guy do eugenics. Like, Miles' plan is nonsense if this was his motivation. But the motivation itself is true. And the story only works thematically if Miles kind of has a point, and therefore Wax has to now realize some of the problems of the world and maybe work to change them in better ways. But he doesn't. And that's weird. Like, the focus very much remains on the problem is that there's crime. And now Wax is going to be Batman. And he's going to beat up all the criminals, or rather shoot them. That's another thing, by the way. The heroes of this book have a absolutely insane body count. Like, the number of people Wax and Wayne just slaughter in this book is ridiculous. It is, and it's weird because it's never questioned. Like, most of these people are just like random goons who are just working for the wrong guy. And like, you know who else were just random goons working for the wrong guy? All those people in Set's palace in Mistborn Era 1, in the second book, who were just slaughtered indiscriminately by... What is wrong with me right now? What the hell is the name of the main character? Vin! Slaughtered indiscriminately by Vin that one time. And that was portrayed as, like, a really dark moment. That was portrayed as, like, oh crap, Vin's, like, lost it. She needs to back off from what she's doing. Like, this is inexcusable what she just did. And she, like, had trauma about it forever. And then in this book, Wax does the same thing twice in this book. He just, like, kills dozens of people without being injured at all, by the way, which is also just unrealistic. Like, it made sense for Vin. She was Mistborn. Wax is just a misting. He should not be able to kill dozens of people who are heavily armed and better armed than him, frankly. He should not be able to do that. Like, it felt fake. Every time he was somehow not getting hit by people shooting him, I was like, this it takes me out of the story. But that's not even my point here. My point here is he just kills all these people and he never has any problem with it. And Marasi has a problem with, like, the first guy she kills, and then after that she also just starts gunning people down. And it's like, what is this? Like, no other Sanderson book has this attitude towards murder. Like in every other Sanderson book, death is treated with significantly more gravity than this. And like Mistborn was sometimes guilty of this, like Vin would sometimes kill a bunch of people and it would feel kind of off. But really it would mostly be Kolos, and that book kind of you sort of felt like Kolos were sort of treated as like mindless monsters, even though they weren't, which was kind of weird, but still, like there was an excuse of some kind there. But here it's just like indiscriminate murder by our heroes all the time, constantly. And yes, it's in self-defense, but like it's still killing a bunch of people. It should mess them up, at least somewhat. And Wayne is like deeply traumatized by that one time he killed a guy, and that guy was actually like a good guy who had a family, and it's like haunted him ever since. And the only result of that is that he doesn't use guns, but like he still kills people. He just kills them with blunt force trauma. That's weird. This book's attitude towards violence is just weird. But not as weird as its politics, because like I said, the book seems to not want to admit that there are problems with the status quo right now. And this might be something that is handled in later books, but within this book, the feeling I am left with at the end is that this is a world in which things are mostly fine. The systems work, the laws are mostly just, and the problem is that there are people who are breaking those laws, and they're criminals and they are evil. And that is a weirdly simplistic worldview that, again, is not present in any other Sanderson book. So I'm assuming that this is something that's going to change in future books, and I'm definitely going to keep reading Mistborn Era 2, don't get me wrong. But it's weird. And here's a really specific example of how it's weird. This is actually something that was in the first half of the book, but I forgot to talk about last time. Broken window theory is mentioned in this book by name. Marasi says it, and then she explains it, and she explains it wrong. So here's the thing. In real life, the broken window theory of policing is the idea that petty crimes, the sorts of crimes that lead to broken windows, graffiti on the walls, public urination, like crimes that sort of just affect the general vibe of a space, that those crimes should be cracked down on, like really hard. You should round up and arrest everyone who breaks a window, everyone who sprays graffiti on the walls, anyone who does something like that, everyone, like, jaywalks, whatever, litters, throw them in jail. And that this will, because those minor crimes are no longer happening, this will sort of like raise the quality of life in the neighborhood, and that in turn will lead to more major crimes not happening in the first place. And this is a very, very problematic and messed up theory in real life of policing, because those people wouldn't be doing those minor crimes if the space they were in was better, if they were in better economic circumstances. Like, minor crimes like that are directly correlated with economic hardship and quality of life, low quality of life. So the solution is not to round up and arrest all those people, the solution is to improve their quality of life. And the weird thing this book does is that Marasi explicitly says the words broken windows theory. She talks about it. But what she means by broken windows theory is what I just described as the good thing to do. Like, she says that broken windows theory is that if the living conditions and the economic state of a place are bad, then the government should step in and fund improvements and repairs to the infrastructure and improve the quality of life of a neighborhood, and that will lead to a lowering of crime rates. which is true, but it's literally the opposite of the broken windows theory of policing in real life. And apparently, from what I remember, Marassi says that this is something that is now being tried out in Ellendale. And so what that means is that Sanderson has taken a really, really bad policy from real life and changed it to be a really, really good thing, and then said, yeah, the government's already doing that good thing, so, like, there's no justification for all this crime. What? I don't know, I feel weird about that. I don't know how I feel about that, even like a week later. I've been thinking about this one line for a week, and I cannot get a read on what this is. Is Sanderson, like, on purpose trying to rehabilitate the image of the broken windows theory of policing? That would be weird, because I feel like a lot of stuff in every other Sanderson book seems to point to him having a decent understanding of what drives desperate and impoverished people to criminality. Or if he just, like, did he not know that broken windows theory is a real thing? Did he just hear the name and assume it was something else without doing any research? Is broken windows theory used to refer to something else in Utah than it is in New York City? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this really, really weird thing he did with this concept of broken windows theory. So I'm just going to leave it. I'm not even going to talk about it anymore. I just had to get this off my chest. It is super weird that he did this, and I feel weird about it. Okay, let's now scratch all of that. I've gotten everything I hate about this book, not hate, everything I have issues with about this book off my chest. Let's talk about the good stuff, and the good stuff is mostly the epilogue. So, the end feels really promising. First of all, the reveal that the bad guy behind everything all along was Wax's supposedly dead uncle. That was an actual good twist. Like, that was surprising. That wasn't just following a cliche plot structure. Because the obvious way for the story to go, and the way I thought it was going to go, is that Wax's uncle had stumbled across this plot and been murdered for it. Not that Wax's uncle faked his own death and also tried to murder Wax. But in hindsight, it makes so much sense, because I was wondering, like, how the hell did they buy out the butler who's been working for them, like, for decades? And they didn't. He was just still working for his old boss. So that seems super promising, and having him be the villain in the future seems much more promising than Miles ever was, because I feel like the uncle is going to have some actual interesting things to say. There was the mention of men of gold and red, bearers of the final metal, in Miles's last words, which implies that we are bringing back a supernatural threat into the story. And while I was originally optimistic about the lower stakes of this story, because I feel like too much fantasy has super high stakes, I feel like part of the problem with this story is that maybe Sanderson didn't quite know what to do with those low stakes. And that's part of the reason why Wax killing all those people feels off to me, because it would have made sense if he was killing them to, like, save the world. But it feels weird to just slaughter a bunch of people with no remorse to, like, save 4 people who've been kidnapped and stop some train robberies? Like, don't get me wrong, it's really messed up what's happening with those women who've been kidnapped. It's incredibly dark and incredibly messed up, and he should do everything in his power to stop them. But he should at least flinch about killing everyone involved indiscriminately, in my opinion. Like the regular mooks who maybe don't even know what they're doing. Like, they don't even know that all this dark shit is happening with the women that they kidnap. They have no idea what's happening. Maybe they think that those women have been released. Who knows? Do the regular, like, street thugs who work for Miles even know who Miles works for? I don't think so. So yeah, I've gone on a tangent again. Back to the good stuff. So the good stuff is the future looks like it's going to bring back a higher stakes threat, which I think is where Sanderson is at his best. Even though Way of Kings kind of disproved that, I guess, because in Way of Kings, most of the situations are super low stakes and localized, and yet they're some of the best stuff he's ever written. Huh. Maybe this book was just too short. Maybe this book just didn't have enough time to develop. Anyway, Marsh is alive. Somehow. What? How? How? And apparently, so are the Kandra, because he mentions them. So apparently there's... No, sorry, he doesn't mention them. Hoyd mentions them, or at least who I assume is Hoyd, in the Ars Arcanum at the end, the little addendum at the end, which describes the magic system, which I'm pretty sure is written from the perspective of either Hoyd or one of his other associates who travels between worlds. I'm assuming Hoyd, because if it wasn't Hoyd, then Hoyd didn't make an appearance in this book at all, and that would be weird, so I'm going to assume that was Hoyd. Anyway, so the Kandra are still alive, and Marsh is still alive. Both of these are very weird and surprising, and I want to know how it happened, but they're also very exciting, and I'm extremely looking forward to seeing where that goes. Yeah, so I am weirdly optimistic about the future of this particular book. Like, I think there's hope. Not this book, this series. I think there is a good chance that this first book was just kind of a weird bad apple, and that the rest of them aren't going to be like this. If the second one is like this, I'm going to have to reconsider my opinion. But right now, when I get to the second book, I'm going to go into it with the assumption that it's going to be good and that I'm going to like it. And I'm not going to blame that book for the sins of this one. Or at least I'm going to try not to. But yeah, I should get back to finishing the first part of Words of Radiance, which is a much better book, which I'm enjoying immensely. And it's also gotten me out of my reading rut. Like, this took me weeks to read, even though it's tiny, and now I've read, like, basically a part of Words of Radiance, which is the size of this entire book, in just a couple of days. So, clearly my reading rut, which I thought was just a me thing, was actually just a this book thing. Who'da thunk? So yeah, see you next week for Words of Radiance, and, right, final thought. I ship Wayne and Steris. Wayne and Steris should be a couple. I will not elaborate on that. Goodbye.